Hello, everybody. I was trying to do my Dr. Nick impersonation, who was the character from The Simpsons who went to upstairs Hollywood Medical College, but I'm not very good at impressions, so we'll just keep moving. The purpose of today's video is to simply review evolution and the important parts, of course, covering our man, Charles Darwin. But before we get started, we need to have a fact of the day. And here it is. During the American Revolution, there were 40,000, I guess they would be considered British Americans, that were technically British citizens that fled to Canada during the Revolutionary War so that they could remain faithful to the crown. Didn't know that. There were actually some sympathizers to the crown during the American Revolution. Didn't really know that. Thought everybody here wanted to be free. But some were still loyal to the crown. Anyways, let's talk about evolution, right? Evolution is a change in an entire species over a long period of time. I tried to stress the importance of trying to understand how long of a period of time we're talking about to make this change. We're not talking about, oh, my friend went away to college and he's so evolved as a person. That's garbage. We're talking about thousands of generations where subtle changes to fit better to the environment take place. And over a very gradual amount of time, we get new species branching off from each other. Some go extinct, some evolve into other species. And so that is kind of what evolution is in its basic form. Question is, well, how do we know that? How do we not know that we weren't just these animals planted on the earth that we see today? Well, we talked about the fossil record, where we looked in the ground and we came away with those two big things, is that the things that were in the ground are not the same as the stuff that lives above ground. And the deeper we dig, we find even different species, meaning that the environment's changing through the years, as we learn through fossil and core research and atmospheric data that we were able to obtain. That's all boring earth science stuff. Anyways, we have learned that as the environment has changed on this planet, so have the species alongside it. And that was kind of what kicked off this idea of evolution. So we looked at fossils, right? That's what paleontologists do. We learn the earth is constantly changing, and so are the species along with it. That's what the fossils have shown us. And most of the species that were in the ground are extinct. They're gone. Lived, died, gone. So that was the first half of the unit on evolution, was just being like, what are fossils and how do we know that? Then the second part, well, I guess there were three parts really. The second part was, well, how did we go from nothing to something? So we started to talk about Earth's early history and how the planet was not a place that you would want to live. You couldn't live. It was too hot. There was no oxygen. There was no ozone layer, right? There was UV rays even worse than there are now coming down on us. And so it was not a great place to sustain life, but it was a great place to give rise to life. And with all of this heat and source of carbon, electric storms, right? We talked about this bubbling brew that through the solar vents and the electric storms, we were able to go from inorganic molecules to organic molecules. That's what the Miller-Urey experiment showed us. Sidney Fox took it even further and was able to replicate primitive Earth and get organic molecules. Of course, in between that and the fossils is a big, huge gray area, since you can't get fossil evidence of organic molecules, or you don't get fossils of bacteria. So there's a big gray area as to what happened there, but we know that that's when we started to form some kind of protobiont or protenoids and coacervates. They were all formed to eventually give us cell-like structures that became the prokaryotic cells that exist even today. Another big one, right, was, well, we didn't have any oxygen. Where did that come from? Well, believe it or not, it came from photosynthesis. There were anaerobic species living on our planet for many, many years before the evolution of photosynthesis, which did cause the first mass extinction. Many species living on the planet looked at oxygen as a poison. And when photosynthetic bacteria came on the scene and produced enough oxygen in the atmosphere, forming the ozone layer as well, that is what killed a large amount of bacteria, the first mass extinction that we know of. Another big jump that we wanted to talk about was, how do we go from prokaryotic to eukaryotic cells? Well, that's the good old endosymbiotic theory, where bacteria that could carry out photosynthesis and cell respiration would be consumed by larger cells, and instead of being digested, they created a symbiotic relationship, endo, within the cell, and so they stayed. And that was how we got eukaryotic cells. And that's kind of how we go against that whole cells are the basic unit of structure and function. Well, they also have cells living inside of them. Well, how do we know further about evolution? Well, we went into comparative anatomy, and that's simply what it is. We compared the anatomy of living things on our planet, where we noticed things like homologous structures and analogous structures and vestigial structures, which showed that life is just this ever-changing thing on our planet. And we right now are just a snapshot of the collection of living things in this form, right? If we were to take a snapshot 10,000 or 20,000 or 30 or 100,000 years ago, you would see some of the same species, but they're a little bit different because they've been slowly changing. We take a snapshot a million years from now, same thing. Some of the species will be gone, some of them will have changed into other things. And so these types of things show us that we're just a moving piece of artwork, I'd like to say. Vestigial structures are the classic example of, yeah, structures are changing. They're getting smaller, going away. Another example of comparative anatomy is our embryology. Okay, we all develop along the same lines. And also, we're all made up of DNA. Okay, we all have the same universal molecule at our core. Okay, and so these are the things that we all share in common, that shows that we've all evolved from a common ancestor, right? That was the big key word. So when you put together your atmospheric data, your fossil evidence, your comparative anatomy, and all the things we've observed in nature, how species can change, right? Antibiotic resistant bacteria and insect that are resistant to insecticides or fungicides and things like that. Those are all examples of evolution that we've observed, like the peppered moth too. So we had some initial theories. We talked about a bunch of guys, Lyell and Hutton and some of those guys and what they were looking at. Of course, the one we most look at is the guy who got it wrong, um, but he had some right ideas. This whole use and disuse. And usually we bring him up is because it's important to understand why he's wrong, and it helps us to understand more why Darwin is right? Because genes can't change that fast. And his premise was just, oh, well, if you reach, your offspring's going to have a longer reach, right? If you need this to survive, your offspring's just going to have that thing, right? We know that it has to be in your DNA for it to be passed along. And so his timeline was way off. His ideas were right that species are changing, but they can't just do it with this sheer will, because then every kid would be much taller and have these giant brain cases, because they would need to be smarter to survive in the next generation. And so that just wouldn't, that's just not what we're observing. So he was wrong, because it's not possible. And guys like August Weismann, chopped the tails off of mice and said, look, they survived without tails, and so what happens in their lifetime does not affect their DNA. Luckily, we got Charles Darwin, who went around the world as a naturalist on a boat, and he was able to observe lots of species in lots of places, especially on islands where there are very unique species, which created lots and lots of questions. And he was already a very interested man in these things. Once he got to the Galapagos, his mind was totally blown by all the endemic species that live there. Endemic means only found in that area, like marine iguanas, for example, are only found in the Galapagos. And so when he looked at how these species were similar to species in other places but had different adaptations to survive, he realized that evolution was taking place. A long time went between what he saw here, whether it was the marine iguanas or the finches or the tortoises on the different islands. It took him a few years to put together all of his pieces. What were they? Well, we like to look at them as OC Vance, right? Overproduction, where we produce more than can survive. Of course, that leads to competition. Then there is variation through mutation and sexual reproduction. Not all offspring are the same. Not all offspring have the same chances of being successful and surviving. Right? That is where adaptation comes in. The ones with the right DNA to survive and reach adulthood and are able to reproduce have gone through this adaptation. And then they will be able to reproduce and pass along those favorable traits to the next generation, which we know as natural selection, aka survival of the fittest. The classic example is there's lots of variation, right? As individuals try to survive, some have favorable traits. It seems here that there are no predators of concern, so camouflage is not the important trait here. It seems that it is too cold, and so being a darker color to absorb more sunlight is a better adaptation. And so over time, right, you're going to see these offspring with darker coats so they can stay warmer in those cold months. And so we talked about fitness and how fitness is a little bit different than just exercising, right? Fitness is your ability to survive in your environment, how well suited you are, right? If you got a big brain, then you have a high fitness as a human for this environment, right? If you have good eyesight, then you have a high fitness or a good chance of survival if you are a bald eagle. Saw a bald eagle flying over our house today. Not too bad for downtown Cortland. Other related terms, right? We get speciation, where there's a formation of new species. This is when the species become reproductively isolated, whether through geographic or different behavioral, or just their mating times don't sync up. And we get that. And then, as we said, there are examples of evolution that have occurred that we have seen in the last, say, 10 or 20 years. Whether it is this antibiotic resistant bacteria, right? People don't use penicillin like they used to anymore because most bacteria have evolved past it, and many other antibiotics that we've created. Same thing with different types of pesticides and herbicides, right? We've created weeds and funguses that we can't figure out a way to spray chemicals on and kill them anymore. There are super funguses and super weeds out there that can't be destroyed by chemicals anymore. We talked about the peppered moth during the English Industrial Revolution, and even Darwin's finches are another great example. So those are all some examples of evolution. And there's your good old peppered moth. Okay. So that wraps up evolution, and I'll be back to talk about the unity and diversity of living things next time. So this is Mr. Andraco from Biology in the Basement, signing off.